Welcome, everybody. And today I'm talking with Jana, who I found, or should I say found me, kind of serendipitously because of this very podcast. And the timing was perfect because we were able to kind of stop the presses to record this very special episode about gender to get it out in time for June, which many people celebrate as Pride Month. So I'm really happy to have a new fellow soundsmith as a friend. And that's not a real word, by the way. I was just kind of making it up. So speaking of words and labeling and how we talk about it, you're in for a bunch of new fun vocabulary as we try to describe parts of your voice, like what makes up what we hear in someone's voice and how we kind of categorize people in our minds based on how they sound. So now let's get on with the show. I'm Bianca, your personal American accent coach, and I'm here to help you master an American accent in English because your voice is your choice when it comes to how you sound. I try to release a podcast episode every 2 weeks, and so you should really subscribe to whatever podcast platform you use so that you don't miss the newest episode. And by the way, if you want to see the full video of the episode, it's available at Accent Coach Bianca on YouTube. Now, let's get on with the show. Welcome, everybody. I'm so excited because I just met this person not long ago and our relationship grew really fast. And suddenly we find ourselves now recording this podcast episode, which is perfect for Pride. And I wanted to actually let you take it away if you don't mind. And you can tell our little history of how we met and what you do. So give us a quick introduction if you don't mind.
Hi, I'm Jana. I'm a voice alteration teacher and also general voice change teacher. I actually met Bianca not super long ago, like last week. I found your channel, because I'm always trying to find niche YouTube channels, honestly. Trying to find scientific YouTube channels just to get past all the fluff at the top. And I found yours and I was looking through your videos. I found that we have a very close history. We both started teaching in COVID. We both lived in Jordan for a lot of years. So I already felt a source of connection to you, actually, because we lived through the same experience, right?
Yeah, we had a lot of similarities. And when you contacted me, I was like, who is this person and where have they been forever? And it was just, it's funny when you meet people like that you just click with suddenly. But I think that's the beauty of what we both do. Like you said, you're looking for something that's really niche. You're looking to go past kind of the general stuff. And that's where I feel like you find your people. And so I'm really grateful, first of all, that we found each other and that we're doing this less than a week later. And I was like, oh my God, we have to get out this episode as soon as possible. So we quickly got all of our thoughts together. And my guess is, guys, this is not the last you're going to hear from them because we have so many things to talk about. We're going to try to keep it kind of focused specifically on gender and voice and accent and kind of the intersection of those things. So let's start, Jana, with what we're going to call gendered patterns in accents. Start us off by telling us what you think about that title and what comes to mind.
Well, this is a very interesting question because accents are super huge. Everything we do is an accent. Gender is an accent. Going from a masculine sound to a feminine one is technically still an accent. And I know the definition of an accent is the type of sound that meshes with your regional area, right? That's the regional accent definition. But that still doesn't explain what goes into it. To us in the gender change sphere, when we're talking about accents, we're talking more about the micro articulation differences. So where you're placing your tongue, whether your consonants are sounding sharp versus sounding more dull, to us, that's, a gender change coming in accents. So I'm actually very curious, to you, how would you define an accent and what goes into it?
Wow. Let's just take a deep dive then. First off, for everybody, look, we're not messing around here. Let's jump into what do we mean by accent? To me, the way you just described it, it's how do you define culture, right? And culture is okay, we are people who do this. We're the kinds of people who do these things, and culture is what we do. oh my God, that's everything. That's everything. And
Literally.
so, you've got cultures, you've got subcultures, you've got like countercultures, you've got and I feel like it's the same way. To me, accents are like culture coming out of your mouth. I don't mean just like you said, like, oh, we're similar to the people we're around regionally. That's just the tip of the iceberg. Accents can show your history, right? They can show your preferences. We can change them. We can hide parts of ourselves. We can display things that we want to do. We can be different people with different people. That's what I'm trying to say. So for me, if we were to take a bird's eye view on that, the way I kind of frame it out is I like to say there's 5 P's in a way, like the letter P is what I'm trying to say, because it's just easy and it sticks in the mind. A lot of people are going to say pronunciation, 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 right? But that's just one part of production. And production is just one part of your accent. So for me, if I were to say production, I do mean pronunciation, and I mean vowels and consonants, right? And like you said, where's the articulation? How hard or soft is the airflow? Like so many things. How much pressure am I pushing of the tip of my tongue onto the ridge behind my teeth? And like so many little things that are really difficult to map out, right? Let alone think about and perceive, right? So pronunciation, what we call prosody, which is kind of, for me, it's kind of the music behind the language, right? Rhythm, intonation, things like that. If we're talking about gender, which is also in a way performative, right? Like you take on a persona, and that might be different with different people as well. Then voice is one part of that. But what I wanted to say is the prosody and the posture too. So I don't know about you, but like, let's say just purely language, forget about gender for a second, purely language. If your muscles are speaking language number 1 for years and years, and then you switch over, then your muscles are going to cause those same sounds, you think, to come out differently, right? So that to me leads to perception and how my hearing sounds and how am I perceived and me as a person, right? So personhood and personality. And then we just said performance, right? To me, that's number 3, your presence, your persona. I'm getting a lot of P's in here. I love alliteration. We already mentioned perception. To me, that's number 4. And I mean that in both ways. I mean, like, how do I perceive sounds? And how do I perceive somebody as a person, or how am I perceived, right? The way that, if we're talking about, again, accent, like how is my speech and my trends and my patterns, how is that perceived, right? How do people, I guess we could say, gender me, or how do they put me in a box, when they hear that? And that's also cultural too, right? Like I might sound more feminine in one place and more masculine in another. We'll talk about that later, but that can come down to like pitch and all kinds of things. But prejudice, power as well. If we're talking about perception and gender, to me, these are big issues. Like, I don't know if that's true for you.
How prejudice and power relate to accent? Because I'm not familiar with these terms.
Wow.
But I've noticed they're part of your philosophy, right?
Oh, yes, to me. Okay, so why did I even start this? I feel like you're interviewing me now. Awesome. So like, I feel like, so I lived, like you said, I lived in Jordan. I lived in Canada. I lived in the US. I'm living in Mexico now. And maybe it is just my perception, right? Because that can be very personal. But people are judged often by the way they speak, right? Hands down. So prejudice or bias, it can be technically positive or negative, right? I can say, I don't know, oh, the Australian accent is so much fun. They're all such fun people, right? That's still a bias, even though it sounds kind of positive, it's still bias. But prejudice is something that, like, oh, this person didn't get this job because the person hiring is not partial to people with accents who are from India, let's say, right? So that can cost people time, money, friendships. They can lose power, things like that. So this is what I've seen kind of in a lot of places. So for me, some of the work I do is kind of related to social justice because I'm trying to equalize the playing field a little bit, as much as I can. So that's the relationship kind of that I see. And I think we can easily draw conclusions between like prejudices in how one speaks and also prejudices, for gender, or if we're talking like all over the rainbow, let's say, there's always prejudices even within. That's how I'm seeing it myself. What about you?
That is actually really interesting. It also reminds me, like, the way you describe bias with like benevolent discrimination, where we attribute like positive traits onto people, but that's still like a big thing to throw on like a group of people. Your question again was like, how do I perceive it? Like,
yeah, when you asked me to say like what I thought of the perception and the prejudice and the power and how that's related, I want to hit that tennis ball back in your court and see like, how do you feel about that, with your history, with what, with the people that you work with? Like, how is it that accent or speech and voice, how does that intersect with gender and maybe power issues?
That's actually a really good question. Because like we always have this shadow behind us of this hyper feminine or hyper masculine ideal that you feel like you should fit into. But voice range is so wide. Like, it's completely valid choice to go for like a lower pitch female voice, for example, or not go all the way in terms of like your vocal tract size. That's completely valid option. You asked me earlier, what makes like things gendered in accents? And if we're going by the definition that like, everything's accents, or as you said, like beautifully, like accent culture flows through our mouth, was it?
Something like that's the first time I've said that, but you inspired me to think about it that way. And I was like, yeah, it seems to me like we've got all this culture, we've got all this history, and how I talk is going to somehow maybe either represent that, or I'm going to maybe hide some of that. And so, yeah, thank you for inspiring that. So yeah, sorry, keep going.
Thank you. But yeah, like when we're talking about vocal gender, I guess vocal size is the most inherent thing that changes your gender. And it's going to have a way bigger effect than you sharpening your consonants, for example, or having your tongue really far forward, also creating a smaller mouthpiece with your mouth. We call that scientifically like R1, or the first resonance space, though it's not always the best to call it like that or use that scientific language, because we want people to be able to play with it immediately and have a very intuitive idea of like what it means. Like when I say size, somebody can think, okay, they're probably talking about like vocal tract size. And as I demonstrated earlier, if you like change your throat, you are changing like the gendering of your voice, especially if you change like the other things alongside it. To me, as I said, that's more inherent. So a very interesting question that is coming to my mind, like how do we know what differences in accent are just cultural versus how they are like, the Kiki and like Boba thing?
Let's explain that for everybody else. You might be watching this on YouTube, or chances are we're probably just listening. So let's describe, actually, let's kind of do the experiment, right? So maybe you can throw that out there and then people can think about it for a quick second.
Oh, okay. I want you to imagine a very blobbiest shape or like a bubble. And I want you to imagine like a very spiky cactus fruit. You just like picked it off the cactus. It's like still has thorns on it. Which one would you describe Kiki and which one would you describe Boba out of these two?
So if you have to label them, right, which one would it be? So you've got one that's kind of got bumps and it's round. I'm kind of picturing like how we often draw a thought bubble, right? Something like that. And then the other one I'm kind of thinking about like spiky, I think is what you said, thorny in a way. So if one was called Kiki and the other one was called Boba, how would you match them, right? That's the question. That's the question that was posed. This is a whole thing that was done. And what were the results then?
Well, scientists found that like across cultures and across different ages, people consistently found like the more blobbish shape to be Boba and found the more thorny shape to be Kiki. So it tells us that gender is not inherently like subjective. There is some things about it that are like more so inherent. And when I'm asking about like the gendered patterns in accents, part of that really big question is which ones did we like culturally impose that don't really have to be the way it is, and which are the things that are like more inherent.
Exactly. And this is like we're already way down the rabbit hole, guys. But what we're trying to say, I think, is we have, how should I say, predispositions. Let's call it that. We have predispositions to label things categorically as male, female, right? And let's actually back up and think about language. how many languages have gendered nouns, right? If you think of the word bridge or table or chair, and in one language, it's a masculine word, and in another language, it's a feminine word, right? We tend to associate, for example, if in your first language, the word chair happens to be a feminine noun, then you would think of adjectives that go with that, like, oh, chairs are elegant, right? Chairs are, I don't know, spindly and thin and delicate, right? But if in your language the word for chair happens to be masculine, you might think strong, sturdy, other words that you already associate with that gender, right? So I feel like it could go to language, it could go back to culture, like we said, because some of these same things, I'm going to weave two ideas here together. So a moment ago, you were like, it's not just articulation, it's also other things you might be doing with your vocal tract, which we perceive as this is very feminine, this is more masculine, right? We have these preconceived notions which might come from just our culture or our language. So if you take the same thing, let's say, well, I don't know, we could say maybe not pitch, but if somebody kind of has a head voice resonance, right? Some of us will say like, oh, that's very feminine, right? And we'll say like, you take a European and an Asian and I don't know, South American, and across you'd say, oh, generally a head voice is considered to be more feminine or more likely to be like that. And I think that's kind of what we're talking about, right? These preconceived notions of how do I put people into boxes? Into gender boxes, let's say, because that's what a lot of people generally do.
Yeah. And to bring it back to like a way earlier point, you mentioned how your voice might be perceived like differently in different areas like Mexico versus Canada. That also like applies to gender to a certain extent. Some cultures just like speak lower in pitch, and some speak with a lower tongue position, like the British accent, right? And so the way I'm speaking might be gendered two different ways depending on the area.
Depending on where I go, right? Yes, and if I travel quite a bit, that's something I might notice, right? If I'm keeping that same kind of, let's call it accent for lack of a better word, if I'm using my same voice and I go to some of these different places, yeah, I might notice that I'm perceived differently if we're just talking about gender, right? But then what else happens? I don't know if this is true for you, but it's true for a lot of people. When you do travel or when you do go into different groups, we tend to talk like each other, right? So we tend to like talk like the people around us. So I think we also tend to kind of modify a little bit, you know? If I'm at like a girls' night and we're having bellinis or something, it's like later I'm like, wow, my voice got a little bit higher. That was weird. But it just kind of like you match the people around you. So, I mean, I don't know if that's true for you, but I've found that can often be the case. So we have a natural ability there too, I think, to match that.
I agree. And it's definitely the case in my end.
Okay, so if we're talking about like putting people into boxes and categories and, well, what do we mean by that, right? What do we mean by accent? And what do we even mean by gender sometimes? We could keep going down this rabbit hole, but let's zoom back out again to those P's, let's say, right? So I could tell you production, personhood, performance, perception, things like this, prosody, right? Pronunciation, posture, all these things. There's a lot of words that seem to start with P. And one that I want you to talk about right now is, I'm going to say it slowly, peripheralize. It's a verb, peripheralize, coming from peripheral or periphery. So I would like, if it's okay with you, Jana, can you talk about what that means to you if we're talking about pronunciation and accent?
Of course. Peripheralization, its opposite being centralization, are ways of modifying the way you articulate in your vowel space. The vowel space is where your tongue is sitting alongside the jaw and the lips. If you've seen those like triangles where the IPA is labeled on, that is the vowel space. And the thing that is cool is that the more we approach the middle, the center of that, the more neutral our vowel becomes. For example, if the tongue is sitting very neutrally, it becomes an e or a schwa, for those already aware. But the more high the tongue is, like the more high and forward you approach an e, the more back and high we approach an u, and so on and so forth. So when we're talking about the centralization and peripheralization, it's one of those, again, cross-cultural patterns that comes up in accents, where people noticed that feminine speakers tend to have their points of articulation closer to the edges of their vowel space. For example, your E, instead of like a more neutral E, would become a lot higher. E, would again come towards the middle. So the result would be masculine speech blending together more versus feminine speech being very enunciated. And you can also see this pattern extending to like gay men as well, where they tend to speak with a very purposeful way, and so they over enunciate things. Meanwhile, like straight men, again, they're not as enunciated. Do you have any like inputs on that, actually?
Well, yeah, I'm going to kind of summarize a little bit too, because that was a lot of information that I want to make sure everybody got. So if you're watching this as a video, you can see us kind of like doing hand movements. But if you're just listening, close your eyes and think about something kind of like a square or a rhombus, right? Let's make it simple. Let's make it a square or a circle. Let's even go with a circle. Imagine a circle, a bullseye. Let's say you're going to archery and you want to hit the bullseye. It's circular. And let's even use that analogy, right? There's concentric circles. And let's say you want to hit that bullseye and you want to enunciate really clearly. I'll give you an example. You said you were doing E's. I'm going to use the example of as in head or bed. And the reason I'm going to do that is because in a lot of languages, they don't have exactly eh. They have a sound that they write with something like a letter E, but their jaw is more closed, right? So they have a sound that's similar. Well, what we're trying to say is that if you are, let's say, we're going to totally paint with a very big brush here. We're going to say you're like a cis straight man, and you're probably not even going to care about the difference between and right? You're not even going to maybe even hear it or care about it because you're going to kind of smush your vowels and let them all kind of collapse like a black hole into the center. And you're not going to let your vowels kind of spread out, and each one's not going to have its own space. And you're not going to then be able to hear those very fine differences between them. So to summarize what you're saying, if you are going to archery and you hit that bullseye, you are going to enunciate very clearly. Well, I think what you're saying is more women tend to, if we're going to label it that way, women tend to enunciate more clearly and with a finer target, let's say, right? They differentiate their vowels a lot more. And when we say peripheralize, we mean that they are spreading out their vowels. They're making sure each one is very clear and distinct. Whereas if we paint with broad strokes, we can say men, straight men generally don't care as much. So they centralize, meaning they all kind of start sounding like each other in a way, right? So tell me if that summary is kind of accurate, if I were to say that in different words.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Okay. So first of all, to summarize, now what do I think of that? I can tell you that for the most part, yeah, my experience really just jives with that because, okay, let's do it this way. Let's say there's a man who is not out of the closet with his family, right? So he goes home, he goes with his family. He's gonna maybe centralize his vowels a little more and not distinguish them as much. But then he goes out with his friends and all of his friends are gay too. So they're going to be a little bit more, I like how you said enunciate. They're going to enunciate those vowels a little bit more clearly and a little bit more distinctly, right? So you can get somebody who can code switch back and forth. And what are they doing? That's what they're changing, right? They're being more distinct about their vowels, more targeted, let's say, or they're peripheralizing their vowels rather than centralizing their vowels. The thing I find interesting is, and I don't know if it's still true, but there was a study done a while ago that this is something gay men do, but it's not so much something that gay women tend to do. So I think part of that might be like, I am comfortable enough, at least in this group that I'm currently in, to speak in a way that people will notice that, right? Whereas often it's been the case where women who were gay did not want to stick out, right? So they wouldn't speak any differently. They wouldn't code switch often. I don't know if that's still true or if that maybe was a really small study, but I do remember reading that and thinking like, oh, okay, maybe that's a thing. So yeah, we have different codes because again, I think voice and accent is culture coming out of your mouth. So yeah, that's how I would think about that. What about you? Has this been true in your experience? And let's say in your training to help other people change their voice? Is this something where like, you're like, I'm going to show you how to do this. This is what's happening, and this is how you can take control of it.
It very much is. It's one of the three main things we work on when we are working on like changing our mouth space. I mentioned the sharpness versus dullness of consonants. We also work on general tongue positions, like having the tongue really high. That's called evocation. Or having the tongue really low and speaking more with like an ooh mouth shape and vowel shape. But this was like in the past, right? And I always found it not precise enough. And so when I came across this concept of prefilization versus centralization, I was like, oh my God, this is so cool. We can go in each vowel and dull it.
I know you're thinking, but I'm going to pause you right there because this is one of the main, not even problems, but recurring themes that I see, at least in my work, and maybe you've seen the same thing too. It's the language we use to describe these things because it's hard to put your finger on it. It's hard to kind of measure it. It's hard. Everyone has a different sensation inside their mouth, so it's hard to get together on the same page to talk about this. So maybe that was this thing where you finally found something that made sense to you rather than being really kind of ambiguous or what do you mean by soft and hard? Because we have to use language to get our ducks in a row, and talk about this. So I don't know if that's been your experience, but when you said that, I was like, oh man, like often the language we use to talk about these things cannot be the same. And that's cool because this person thought about it this way and this person thought about it this way. But then when we get together, we have to decide, okay, what are we talking about here? Let's call it this. Let's call it centralizing our vowels versus peripheralizing our vowels. And this is what I mean by this. So I don't know if you've had similar experiences in your teaching, but when you say, oh, this is the old way to do it versus, hey, this is how I find it helpful to teach. And I think you said three things. What was the third thing?
Well, the third thing is the centralization versus peripheralization. The one note though, doing like your tongue in very general shapes or doing a macro vowel, like the eification or ofication, is still useful in my opinion because for some students, they do want to like get into the weeds and, modify like each vowel differently. But for others, it's a lot of cognitive load to like place on them. And sometimes just placing your tongue in a certain position and shading your other vowels through it is easier in that case.
I think this is kind of like what we were going to talk about next is, like, how do you reach somebody? This actually goes perfectly with what I was saying about how we label things is like, how do you decide what order to go in? How do you decide how to help somebody, right? Because everyone's so different. Like, kind of like what you just said now, macro versus micro, getting into the weeds. For some people, just realizing that when they speak, they're putting their tongue more forward, more in the center, more in the back, high, low, all these things. Even that's just like, that kind of blows people's minds sometimes because we don't stop and think about it. So you first, what do you find useful in terms of the order in which you go about teaching about voice? And let's try to keep gender in mind too in this. What do you think of first usually?
That's a really good question. I think of pitch first. So many things in voice revolve around your pitch. If you are speaking at a high pitch, I don't have my piano open, but say, you're speaking at a higher pitch, your voice will prefer certain things alongside that. It will prefer being softer. It will prefer being smaller in size rather than like being hooty. And on the opposite spectrum, if you're going low in pitch, say, your voice is going to prefer being a lot lower. And because if you have a really small size, it just becomes very acoustically complicated. So when we start with voice feminization or voice masculinization, we start people off in terms of pitch. What follows is changing their vocal weight, which is a perceptual quality that means whether a sound is like buzzy or very soft. Masculine voices tend to be more buzzy, feminine voices tend to be like more soft. That's kind of like the foundation. And it's much easier to work with those two qualities rather than getting started with resonance, even though resonance is the biggest like gender knob. Me changing my pitch is not going to have as much effect on my gender. High in pitch, and I can have a really big size, and this doesn't sound like exactly masculine, doesn't sound exactly feminine, it's just like something. But doing things that way gives us the correct foundation into things. And then once we go into size and learn to control like the throat size, the R1, after we get a good hang of that, then we focus on the articulation, because one of the things trans voice teachers want to avoid is the student relying too much on what's happening with the mouth instead of like what's happening at the throat. You don't want somebody to be really high on like an E, because to them it sounds like smaller, but still be missing a lot of the change needed with the throat. Does that make sense?
It makes sense to me. I want to make sure that for me, because I have a question, I want to make sure that, so we're talking about voice, we're talking about gender, we're talking about how do I get the perception of my voice in this cultural context to sound more A, feminine, or B, masculine. Let's leave it at that. There are techniques, let's say. And what technique do you start with first? Do you start with voice? You said you start with pitch, right? And I have a question. My question is that because you feel like it's the easiest one to latch onto and identify, and it's basically a small win because it's like, oh yes, I hear that. I got it. Let's keep going. Do you feel like that's one of the reasons you start with that? Because I find that very interesting.
Pitch is something that has been like drilled within us ever since we're little. We change it like all the time in day-to-day conversation. Though we changed a lot of things in day-to-day conversation, but people don't realize it as much as pitch. It tends to be like the most like clear thing for people. But even in those cases, I have to go in and we have to like define pitch perceptually. This is a whole big other topic of sensing things and perceiving them versus the objective reality that is there. Pitch is more simple. It has like a very simple objective reality of being the fundamental frequency of something, like how fast or slow it oscillates. When it comes to perceiving pitch, I usually start off with teaching people what sounds have pitch versus what don't, because I guess like even before pitch, you have to teach someone how to learn. You have to teach them to perceive, contrast things on their own, give them the general tools that are gonna like help them change their vocal gender and keep training even like outside a session. And I find that pitch is like one of the most like interesting things to demonstrate it with because we have been dealing with it like all our lives. But most people get surprised when you tell them like that this sound, I am talking in a whisper right now. Can you hear any pitch in that?
Well, how you just said pitch, you said oscillations, right? So we're talking about vibrations and vocal fold vibrations for people who don't know, right? We have voiced and unvoiced sounds. So let's say I have laryngitis, right? And I'm sick, then I can only talk in a whisper. If I put my hand here, I feel no vibration. I can't even feel anything. So I can say objectively, I can say there is no vibration here. Therefore, the way you're defining it is that there is no pitch, right? Oh, am I getting that right?
Yeah, the way I define it. I know that resonance does have a pitch on its own, and that's kind of forms that I'm not going to go into right now for the sake of scope, but I'm very curious. How do you start accent training? Is there like any foundational thing you have to go through?
So the reason I wanted to clarify it for you, I said, well, why do you start with pitch? Is it because it's something we can grasp onto and it's something I feel like I can put under control pretty quickly and it gives me a small win? And then I think then for you, then you say, okay, well, we're going to do placement later, even though actually it's like way more, I don't even know if important is the word, but it's way more something identifiable. Even if we can't put our finger on it, it's something that we use to kind of label that gender of somebody's voice, right? Placement can be, I think, depends on the culture again, but that's why I was asking because I do the same thing, right? Okay, we've got all these P's of an accent, right? And most people think of pronunciation, and that's what they think of. And it's very easy to grasp, right? If in your language you have, which is likely, you have the E sound, let's go back to E, but you don't have I, right? Oh my God, your mind will be blown if you can finally do an I, right? And you can say beach and the other one. And you can say the other one really clearly, and you know that you're swearing, and then you're like, yes, I got that finally. So to me, I start with generally pronunciation because it is the most, let's say, visible thing. And you can literally mark it. You can say, here are the symbols for these sounds. These are the ones you're doing. This is the one you want. Let's look at the chart. What do you need to modify in order to get there? And to me, it's because it's visual, it's easier to measure, right? So I generally start with pronunciation, even though, again, I wouldn't say this is the thing that makes an accent, right?
You say like pronunciation is visual. Can you talk more about that, please?
I mean, I try to make it visual. Let me put it that way. So remember what we were talking about before the chart? We said, close your eyes. You can kind of picture it as a rhombus or a square or triangles, right? What we're trying to do is see the inside of our mouth, right? And we're trying to poorly put a 3D model onto a 2D piece of paper, and we're trying to draw it out, right, as best we can. And we're going to say, okay, where do I put my tongue? How open or closed is my jaw? And then also, is there anything I'm doing with my lips, if we're just talking about vowels, in order to shape the air to make a sound that you're going to recognize? Let's think about English versus Arabic, let's say, right? So for people who don't know, maybe you can go talk about vowels quickly in Arabic, because I know there's like 3 that you write. There's others that you don't really write. You just kind of make a mark sometimes, and they're there, but they're kind of light. Maybe you can talk about what is a vowel in Arabic.
That is, I am not an Arabic teacher. So from what I remember from like the, like Arabic school days, you have waw, alif, and ya. Those are like the major vowels. But then you have accents on, is it called accents? I forget what.
When you're writing it, we call them diacritics. It looks like an accent because it's kind of on top of the letter, right? You add a little line or you add a little symbol of, you kind of shade that. It's on top of a consonant, but you're saying, here's a consonant and you're going to add this like, how should we say, light vowel to it, right? So yeah, that's how I would describe this idea of writing an accent on top of the writing. Yeah.
That is so cool. You live with something for so long, but you don't think about it.
You don't, like our tongues, right? Our tongues are in our mouth, and yet people are like, oh my God, I can move it around in my mouth. Are you kidding? Like, I can't believe it. So the point I guess I'm trying to make is like trying to visualize pronunciation. It depends on where you're coming from, what you're used to, right? How you think of it. But let's then take spelling in English, right? Let's take double O, right? Just double O. It can be oo as in boot. It can be as in book. It can be as in blood. And that's just a super simple example. So when we see the spelling in English, which is how a lot of people learned English if it was their second language, and they learned it by reading and writing, not so much the sounds, we need something to simplify that because English is awful when it comes to spelling and its transparency to how you pronounce it. So that's why we mentioned it before, IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet, so that we can have a symbol for each of the sounds, right? And if you look at all the sounds in all the languages, well, that's probably not even complete if you're given all the accents and things. But we can say like, here's a symbol. Okay, let's take in English, the letter I, but the little one, right? Little stick, little dot. In IPA, that means this E sound that we're looking at. On the other hand, guys, if you haven't seen this before, if I write like a little capital I, like a small but capital I, that's the I sound, right? So when I say I'm trying to visualize pronunciation, I'm trying to give people the tools where they don't just have to rely on their ears, that they have like another way to think about it. That's why we look at the graphs. That's why we try to kind of chart the mouth space if we can, because yeah, how we learned it often isn't really working for us. So we need other ways to think about it, if that makes sense. Long answer for a really short question.
Actually very interesting. In trans voice training, we actually tend to not focus on the muscles because a lot of it is very internal. So like, you don't want people to be trying to focus on the muscles when it comes to like changing the larynx, because first of all, people will have a wrong idea. They will think if I'm tensing this area here, it means like moving those muscles, when the muscles responsible for raising or lowering the larynx are actually like above or below, because muscles only like pull, they don't push. And a lot of like the motions when it comes to like changing your vocal gender are very complicated. It's not like placing the tip of a tongue towards like the back of the mouth or the top teeth, that is something that can be given with instructions. You can feel the point of contact. You can even see it if you look into the mirror. But being able to change your whole vocal gender, and I'm gonna do an illustration here. So I'm gonna start like low in pitch, and I'm gonna go up higher in pitch, and also make my vocal tract size smaller. And that little motion between like this and this is so complicated. So many things are happening with the larynx, the oropharynx, the back of the mouth. I don't want to like throw terms around here. What I tell my students is like focusing on like the sound for the majority of things. The only thing that is like different, and this is like the pronunciation. So I'm finding it like very fun that you like said you like teach like pronunciation through like visual aids. Does it only happen with like the IPA? Is that the only visual aid you teach, or?
Well, let's think about pronunciation. So we said vowels and consonants, and we're already getting into the territory kind of like you're describing. Like when I say, oh, is this a voiced consonant? Let me feel my throat. Can I feel that vibration? Can I feel that buzzing? Already, I can't see that. I can't look in the mirror. Not really, right? Maybe a little bit, but I can feel it. And the more I think we go into that, the harder it is to see it at all. And what am I visualizing? Unless I get like an anatomy book, it's kind of hard for me to think about the throat. And most people don't know what the voice box and the larynx even looks like, you know? And so I imagine there's a lot of education that kind of goes into that too, because it's a mystery, right? Like we're like, how do we speak? It's magical. Who knows? And just to find out a lot of those things, I think in some ways it's, like I said, it's easier for me to start with pronunciation because we can grasp onto it, we can visualize it, we can get some small wins in there. But like you were saying, placement is probably more of what we want to work on. If we're talking about an accent again in culture, right? We think about placement, right? That's something that we might not be able to put our finger on it, but we say, oh, that person just doesn't sound like they're from here, right? Maybe their vowels are exactly like mine. Maybe, you know, everything else is the same. But if that placement thing isn't there, we notice we don't identify with that person. There's something going on there, right? And I'm going to take you one step further and see what you think. Do you ever talk about breathing and breath? Do you think that breathing has anything to do with gender and how we perceive things?
I rarely bring it up because the body takes care of like how much air you need, like very naturally. We're also speaking, we're not singing. So I wouldn't touch that like wasp nest unless there was reason, unless like the student had like problems with like the air using too much, too little. Notable cases where I do focus on the breath is if the voice is too weak and like the student doesn't use it enough, we'll do some sustaining exercises with the air and then take it to pitch. But you know, that's going a bit sidelined. So I guess to answer your question, like rarely.
Okay. That's maybe something where we kind of differ, is because in accent and language, right? If I'm thinking about, let's say, connected speech, right? So where we pause and where we breathe can be different in different languages. And that might come down to rhythm or pacing as well and parsing things out. So if I don't have enough air, then I might not get to the end of the sentence. And I might have trouble with that in English. Like, happens all the time. Sometimes we have to teach people how to chunk, you know, words and thoughts, because it's different in how we connect the speech and we link up the words. So that comes down to kind of fluidity. And I bring this up because I teach pronunciation first, right? I believe it, like, it starts at breathing. But I'm not going to teach breathing first because it's just very abstract. And I think if I were attending an accent class, let's say I wanted to, you know, get better at my Spanish or my Arabic or my French, and I went to a French accent coach, and the first thing they told me is, well, you're going to have to learn to breathe differently. I probably wouldn't come back for another session because I probably wouldn't get it that first day. So even though I think placement and breath, at least for accent, are incredibly important, it's not something I would start with. Do you know what I mean? To kind of like finish that whole tract that we were on about what order do we usually go things in. If you're talking about voice and changing voice, particularly as it's concerned with gender, then you wouldn't even touch breathing unless you needed to, right? But I think there was a similarity there in that we both find placement really important, but it's not the first thing we teach because I think it's kind of a difficult concept to grasp unless you've got some basics then under your belt. So we're probably similar into that too. Do you want to tell us a little bit about then how, because you've talked a little bit about your work and things like that, how can we get in touch with you? How can we find out more? How can we get into this wonderful world even deeper?
If you guys want to find out more, you can join our communities on Discord. My personal server, my personal studio, little corner of the internet, Possum Vocal Studios. I teach private lessons there if you'd like. And we also have the community at Sanguistics, which is, this really big intersection of language lovers, voice acting lovers, singing lovers, voice interchange lovers. It's combination of all of that. That's the idea behind Sanguistics. So you can join me there. Also, if I had to give credit, I would also like to give a special shout out to Trans Voice Lessons and Jana Rose. So much of my own model is based on hers. So I'm just very thankful for her and
Awesome. Yeah, we should talk more about that on another podcast episode, actually. Yeah, guys, if you want to check them out, then definitely, I think I love when I saw the name of the Discord server, I was like, this is fantastic. It's just such a good name. It's a great name, so it's going to stick with you guys. If you don't remember it, don't worry. Look down in the show notes or in the description down below. Yeah, and you can find them on Discord in either of those two servers. And I think you and I, Jana, we've got to come back and talk more about this stuff because I want to go down the rabbit hole with you a little bit more on many of these topics. And guys, if you have any questions or if you have any things that are niggling at you and you say, oh, I want to hear more about this little topic, let us know and we can actually just hop on and talk about that another time. So yeah, anything else you want to add before we say goodbye to the audience?
No, that was perfect. The topics were so exciting. And I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm sure it's going to be the beginning of a beautiful friendship. So we'll say goodbye to the audience for now, and we'll say see you guys soon. Thanks a lot, guys.
Bye-bye.
And thanks for listening all the way to the end, everybody. You know that when you do, I tell you a little secret about what's going on lately. And you might know this, but usually I'm recording a podcast episode a few months before it actually drops, and you get it because I try to really plan ahead. But since I met Jana so recently, we did all of this last minute, and I'm having these weird, funny coincidences as well. I was thinking about a name to call my, other word nerd friends, in our community. And there's already this word to describe people with a large vocabulary, which is a wordsmith. Now, you might also know the word blacksmith, and that's the person who bangs on the hot metal to shape it, right? Well, last night, randomly, I was reading this book and I learned a new word for myself, which is called a whitesmith. And I didn't even know there was a name for a person who works with lighter metals like tin or silver. No idea. But that's how I came up with the idea of a soundsmith, because I feel like in my community of word nerds, we're always working with words and bending and shaping the sound a little bit. So I'm going to start using that. It's going to be a soundsmith. I just love how language is always changing and you can kind of invent words and they take on a whole life of their own. And even a wordsmith like me is still learning new words every day. And if you can think about a specific topic about accents or pronunciation that you'd like to hear about, let me know and I'll try to make it a reality. And I'll see you in the next episode.